Bonjour.
Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I call to order the 3,444th meeting of the Human Rights Committee. We shall now proceed with the consideration of the fourth periodic report of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I would like to extend a very warm welcome to the delegation from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, headed by Her Excellency Mme NUSHOBEKWA. And may I now continue in English?
I'd like to note with gratitude the presence of our former chairperson, Mr. Fabian Salvioli, there in the back, and also our former member, Mr. Victor Rodriguez-Recia in the back. Welcome back. I'd like to explain the procedure for this afternoon to the delegation. We're very happy to have you with us. I'd like to extend our warm welcome, very warm welcome once again in English to you. I will give the floor to the head of the delegation first to give opening remarks, and then the members will ask questions. We will divide issues into two parts for this afternoon and tomorrow morning. This afternoon, we'll take up issues 1 to 15, except 13 for technical reasons. So 1 to 15, except 13. And tomorrow, we'll deal with the issues from 16 to 28 plus 13. So we'll deal with question 13 tomorrow. So that's the plan. And after members ask questions on issues 1 to 15, except 13, then we'll have a short break so that the delegation can organize themselves to respond to the questions by the members. And then after the break, the delegation will have an opportunity to reply to the questions and comments by the members. And then I assume that the members will have follow-up questions to the responses that the delegation will give, and then the delegation will have another opportunity to respond. And then after we finish this cycle, we call it first round, then tomorrow we'll move on to the second round. If we cannot finish the first round today, we'll continue tomorrow morning. So that's the plan. With that explanation, and also I'd like to inform the delegation that you have an option to provide us information in writing after the dialogue within 48 hours. So if the members ask technical questions like statistics, you can provide us with information not immediately, but also you have an option to provide us with information in writing within 48 hours. So those are the additional information I wanted to give you. With that explanation, I'd like to give the floor to the head of the delegation, Excellence Mme NUSHOBEKWA, to give her opening remarks. You have the floor, Madame. Vous avez la parole.
Monsieur le Président.
Chairman of the Human Rights Committee, committee members, ladies and gentlemen, the delegation of the Democratic of the Congo, which I'm leading, has the honor to extend its greetings to you and to thank you for your attention. Last year, the DRC had submitted its fourth periodic report to the Human Rights Committee on the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Since my country submitted that report, several other legislative, judicial, administrative measures have been taken to give effect to the rights recognized by the Covenant. The right to equality and the principle of non-discrimination set out explicitly in international and regional human rights instruments are therefore at the heart of human rights. Thus, to align himself with that principle, the head of state, His Excellency Joseph Kabila, promulgated law number 16/008 of the 15th of July 2016, amending and completing law 87/010 of the 1st of August 1987. The latter had highlighted some shortcomings, particularly with respect to the specific issue of the status of married women and the status of children. It was deemed necessary and urgent to adopt the code and to undertake the various reforms set out in the Constitution of the 18th of February 2006, as well as the developments of the national legislation on the protection of the child. More specifically, the new law amending the 1987 Code aims to bring the obligations into line with the two 1966 international covenants entered into by the DRC. These pertain to human rights, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The main new features introduced by Law 16008 of the 15th of July 2016 are the following: doing away with marital authorization for married women and the obligation upon husbands to agree to all legal acts where there is an obligation upon them either individually or collectively, reaffirming the exclusive competence of the Court for Children in all acts involving the state as well as the capacity of the minor child. On the legal front, last year, a mystical tribal movement called the Mamoenela used the civilian population, including children, as human shields. This movement attacked innocent people and public buildings, symbolizing the state's authority. This sect spread terror, decapitated several officers working in the security forces, and at the current time, the justice system in my country wants to ensure that light be shed on all of the circumstances of the crimes in the Kasai region. Therefore, it should be pointed out that several public trials have been opened and have led to the conviction of the perpetrators of these acts. For others, the inquiries and investigations are still ongoing. Nonetheless, notwithstanding the inquiries and procedures conducted by the Congolese justice system, the DRC is awaiting the arrival of a United Nations team very soon, as well as a team of the African Union, to implement Resolution 35/33 of the 23rd of June 2017 of the Human Rights Council, providing technical assistance to the DRC and establishing responsibilities as regards the events that occurred in the Kasai region. As to combating sexual violence, we've been doing this for some years now. The question of responsibility for violent crimes in the DRC remains at the very heart of government efforts. The government restated its commitment to strengthen a zero-tolerance policy for sexual violence crimes and to adopt measures to combat impunity by initiating proceedings against the perpetrators of sexual violence, regardless of their social status. Significant progress has been made in recent years, to such an extent that the situation has changed, and today the UN recognizes that sexual violence has dropped by 85% in the DRC. I'm also pleased to announce that the DRC was withdrawn from the list of countries recruiting child soldiers. With respect to other measures taken to implement the Covenant, I should point out that quite apart from the national policy to reform the justice system 2017-2016, which aims to build up a high-quality justice system for all, which is independent and which protects human rights. There are plans, strategies and programs to implement the covenant in the various sectors concerned by it. I would also like to inform you that the Democratic Republic of the Congo is decisively committed to the electoral process. The current statistics provide figures of almost 41 million persons enrolled, approximately 21 million men and 19 million women. This gives a percentage of 48% for women. I would also like to inform you, and my apologies, says the Speaker, by implementing the rights recognized in the Covenant, and I've just underscored this point, the government of the Republic has proven its intention to discharge its obligations on the basis of good faith pursuant to the Covenant. I thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency, Madame NUSHOBEKWA, for your introductory statement.
Members of the committee for their questions, and as I said before, this afternoon we'll deal with questions and issues from 1 to 15, except 13. So I now give the floor to Mr. Dufourville. You have the floor. Vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, sir. I too would like to extend a very warm welcome to the delegation from the DRC, particularly through you, Madam Minister, and I would like to thank all of you for having travelled from Kinshasa, which I think demonstrates the DRC's commitment to protecting human rights, and in particular to our covenant. The last review by this committee took place 10 years ago when we reviewed the situation in the DRC. The submission of the fourth periodic report took place last year in 2016. So 10 years, that's a very long time. There's been a space between the two reports of 15 years, and in 2016 the committee had regretted this very lengthy period that had elapsed between the submission of both reports. But we do know that during that period of time, history has not spared the DRC, and that difficulties and hurdles to the full realization of human rights remain. Madam Minister, to take up your words in a different body, we can now breathe in the DRC. We're aware of this. We see that there's a flourishing cultural life in Kinshasa in particular, but also in other towns in the country. And we also see the vivaciousness and the activism of civil society, and I'd like to hail their contribution to this consideration, and there are many of them here today, and thank you for travelling from such a long distance to be here. However, amongst all of the promises made 10 years ago, including promises made to this committee, some were fulfilled, others were not. During this exercise, it's not about determining and establishing responsibility, but rather through a constructive dialogue, a dialogue which I hope will be candid and frank, we're going to determine together the ways and means of overcoming and implementing the covenant. But since the committee is not only a treaty body, but also a body of the United Nations, by way of introduction, I would like to pay tribute to the role that the United Nations organization plays in the DRC, in particular with respect to the men and women taking part in MONUSCO, the staff of the OHCHR, and all of those individuals who are far from home and place themselves to the service of the DRC and sometimes at the risk of their own lives. We should recall that recently, in October, 2 Tanzanian soldiers of MONUSCO, Mr. Bufaza and Shivon, died during an attack by an opposition armed group, whilst 2 members of the experts of Security Council were murdered cowardly in March. I would like to pay tribute to the memory of a number of individuals, because I think by remembering them, we are also remembering all of those who have fallen victims and continue to be victims of human rights in the DRC. I think we also need to stress the link in the DRC that unites peace, justice, and the respect for human rights. Of course, this link is present in all countries, but the situation in the DRC seems to highlight this point then in many other countries. Respecting human rights requires an end to violence and the re-establishment of peace as a free exercise of all Congolese persons of the rights. And we will come back to the issue of the electoral process that you also mentioned. But respecting human rights also means the end of impunity for the perpetrators of human rights violations. And I would like to stress this issue of impunity from the very outset. I wish to remind you of an old document, that is to say, the conclusions of the so-called mapping report. I don't really like that term in English. The mapping report, which had been conducted by the High Commission in 2010, and which was an inventory of human rights violations committed between 1993 and 2003. There were two basic recommendations. First of all, a finding, the fact that impunity had only discouraged the commission and encouraged the commission of new human rights violations, and they continue today, as stated by the authors of the report. And another important finding, and that is that to prevent future violations, there is a need to set up a holistic policy for transitional justice, which would base itself on various and complementary mechanisms that would be legal and non-legal in nature. A lot of promises have been kept, I did say that, and some of these I would mention now. And you mentioned these in your introductory statement, Madam Minister. I would note the amendment of the Family Code, the moratorium on the death penalty, which is ongoing. And in your replies, I note that national consultations are being organized on the issue of the abolition of the death penalty, the adoption of the law 2011 to criminalize torture, we'll come back to that point later, as well as the establishment of the National Human Rights Commission through Organic Law of the 21st of March 2013. We are here to welcome those positive points, but also to discuss the difficult issues. And my colleagues and myself have always addressed these problems in a constructive spirit and in mutual trust. As far as I'm concerned, this afternoon, I will focus on 5 issues: 1, 2, 3, 10, and 15. But before broaching those 5 issues, I would like to ask you a question, first of all, which is to do with the preparatory process of the report. And I'd like to ask you about the follow-up to our concluding observations. You know that our committee is very much committed to the issue of active participation, the active participation of civil society in the preparatory processes of reports that are submitted to this committee. Similarly, we attach a great deal of importance to the national civil society being involved in the follow-up process of the recommendations issued by the committee. It would appear, based on credible sources, that NGOs who wanted to take part in the preparatory process of the report were not able to obtain a visa to enter the country and to participate in this preparatory process with national NGOs. So this is a question that I would like to ask you now from the outset, because I think this is a very important point. And this question will be asked subsequently. And we hope that NGOs will be welcomed with open arms, international NGOs or NGOs from other countries, or indeed members of the diaspora who wish to go to the DRC to take part in that process, which should be as open as possible. I'll turn now to issue 1, questions 1, 2, and 3 on the constitutional and legal framework. As to the legal value of the covenant domestically, you've given a very clear-cut response. Thank you for that. You refer to Article 215 of the Constitution, which provides force of law to the treaty. So I think that's very clear there in legal terms. Now, I don't really understand the fact that the covenant has never been directly applied by national courts. And based on your replies, we could deduce this, unless today you could give us some examples of implementation by a national judge of the covenant. You noted that the state party has undertaken training efforts for judges and perhaps also for lawyers. Perhaps further efforts need to be done in the field of training, particularly cooperation with the United Nations and international instruments, to encourage the authorities and those working in the justice system to refer to the covenant and to other relevant international instruments. In this question, we've also addressed the issue of customary law and customary courts. If I've understood correctly, the replies, the customary courts have completely disappeared and have been taken over by peace courts that only apply customary law where they're not running counter to the law. So I would be grateful to you if you could confirm if I have understood your reply to that question. So there are no longer any customary courts, but only peace courts, which have a link, a coordination between customary courts and national law.
I would also like to ask you what initiatives you've taken to try to identify and, if possible, resolve, perhaps not immediately, but in a broad sense, any potential incompatibility between customary law and the provisions of the Covenant. In this regard, can you provide us with any examples of any contradictions that you've seen, for example, with regard to family law and inheritance law? Are you able to pinpoint any such contradictions? And if so, what's more important, have you tried to start a process to resolve those difficulties? I now move to issue number 2 on the National Human Rights Commission. In the replies to the questions, you speak about the budget of the Commission, and it seems to be quite a large budget. I was actually quite surprised to see that it was 0.11% of the country's GDP. It seems to me to be rather a significant amount, or 0.11% of the budget at least. According to information that we have received from credible sources, in reality, this budget is not totally allocated to the Commission. Only 30% of the monies are actually given over to the Commission, and since March 2017, it appears that the Commission has not received any funds whatsoever. So there seems to be a problem there with regards to the functioning and the budget of the Commission, which apparently doesn't yet have a headquarters and struggles to travel around the country as well. Because, of course, the DRC is an extremely large country, and there is sometimes a need to deploy staff into far-flung regions and provinces of the country so as to make the Commission's work effective. So could you provide us with some clarifications about the allocation of the budget, deployment, and the allocation of means necessary to ensure that the National Human Rights Commission is able to carry out its work effectively? I now move on to issue 3, which relates to the follow-up. The follow-up to the committee's previous concluding observations and the views that the committee adopted under the first optional protocol to the Covenant. I have to say we have very scant information here. Perhaps my colleagues will be able to bring up some specific cases, but according to the committee's follow-up report, it seems that the DRC has only provided us with very little information when it comes to updating and reacting to the views of the committee. So we'd like to see whether the views have been implemented. In the previous concluding observations, the committee had suggested that a follow-up mission from the special rapporteur could be held so that they could work with the state party to discuss potential means of implementation of the views. And I note that in the report, the state party reiterates its openness, its willingness to do so and to accept the committee's suggestion to receive a special rapporteur. So perhaps in the context of this dialogue, we could discuss practical means of implementing that proposal. I move now to issue number 10. This is about the voluntary termination of pregnancy. The committee asked if the state party intended to review its legislation criminalizing the voluntary termination of pregnancy. The state party answered in paragraph 26 of its answers that at the moment the DRC does not intend to revise Articles 165 and 166 of the Criminal Code, given that abortion can have deleterious effects to the health of the mother. So I would like to start a dialogue on this point with the delegation. Perhaps I could remind you of some facts that I would take from the World Health Organization's study of 2013 on safe abortion. That was the second edition of the study, with some findings. First of all, and I quote from the study, when qualified medical staff carry out an abortion in safe conditions and safe hygiene, abortion is a very safe medical practice. It's not me saying this, I'm quoting from the WHO study. The WHO also states that the criminalization of abortion can lead to the use of unsafe abortions, and that these unsafe abortions are dangerous to women's health. There are important figures in this regard that are given, and once again I'm going back to this study. There are 22 million unsafe abortions that are estimated to be practiced in the world every year, and roughly 47,000 deaths linked to pregnancy can be attributed to complications from an unsafe abortion. Furthermore, it is estimated that 5 million women suffer from disabilities as a result of an unsafe abortion. One other thing from the WHO's report, which is important in terms of potential policy, the legal status of abortion has no effect on women's needs to have an abortion, but it does significantly hinder access to safe abortions. So if we come back to the DRC next, some figures from a trustworthy source. 50% of abortions are carried out in Kinshasa. Roughly 1 out of every 100 births leads to the death of the mother. Even in cases provided for by the law, the access to legal abortion remains ineffective in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Lastly, access to contraceptives remains insufficient. So perhaps that could be the basis for our discussion on this matter. ultimately, the WHO's study seems to be in contradiction with what the state party has said, that when it comes to the effects of abortion, and that criminalization can in fact make matters worse. We also asked for statistics on the annual number of deaths, the number of women convicted for having an abortion, and the number of people convicted for having helped an abortion be carried out. We didn't receive any answers to those questions, so I would like to reiterate that question now. I come to my last question, Chairman. This is the last question that I have, even though I will be making some follow-up questions, perhaps by way of reaction to answers that we'll be getting from the delegation. This is issue 15, finally, the prohibition of torture and cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. With regards to the promulgation of the law in July 2011, which I think was a very important event, which we should be pleased about, we asked the state party to describe all measures to implement the law, in particular with respect to state actors. According to the information that we received, generally speaking, this law is not effectively applied or is rarely fully implemented. The state party does give some examples of convictions, but as we had asked, it doesn't give very precise statistics. We asked for precise statistics about the nature of the court that handed down these sentences, the positions held by the convicted persons, and also on compensation, and also, of course, the number of inquiries. But we didn't receive any information or any statistics. So perhaps during this dialogue today and tomorrow morning, perhaps you could provide us with those statistics which would look at which would show how effectively the law is being applied on the ground. Finally, we had asked the state party to comment on information which said that people had died in prisons as a result of torture. There could be other causes, but as a result of torture. And in paragraph 44 of the report, the state party says that allegations of deaths from torture are not true, are not exact. On this point, I would refer back to a document which is the report from a few years ago, but we haven't had any updates since, which is the report on deaths in detention from the UN in 2013, which was a very significant report, which said in paragraph 21 that the case of detainees dying as a result of torture or ill treatment are very concerning. More than 10% of deaths between January 2010 and July 2012 in prisons that were visited and could be put into this category. And the office gives various examples in this regard. So perhaps you could comment on these inquiries that have been carried out by the Joint Bureau in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which do speak about deaths in detention as a result of torture and ill treatment, with figures that are really quite striking. One final question, which we had asked, but I know that you will shortly be submitting your report to the Committee Against Torture, so I suppose you'll be discussing this matter at length there. This concerns the national prevention mechanism. The Committee Against Torture believes that this is of fundamental importance to prevent cases of torture. I believe this mechanism hasn't yet been set up, as according to what you said. Perhaps this will be something for the National Human Rights Commission, but that takes me back to what I asked earlier about the Commission's means, budget and general resources. That is to say, the means which allows it to effectively carry out its difficult but very important tasks. With that, I would like to thank you very much in advance for your answers, and thank you also for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you. I now give the floor to Ms. Patsartis.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I would also like to wish a very warm welcome to the delegation from the DRC for this dialogue at the consideration of the country's fourth periodic report. I would like to thank the delegation for the report and for the answers provided to the list of issues, although I must say that these replies did arrive a bit late. But I do hope that we will have time this afternoon and tomorrow morning to gain some more information. My comments and questions will be dealing with issues 4 and 5 this afternoon. If I look first of all at issue 4, I would like to thank the Minister for the clarifications and updates that she was able to give us about the new legislation from 2016. Issue 4 is about gender equality and harmful traditional practices inter alia. I think there are a couple of issues at this juncture that I would like to raise for the consideration of the delegation. I would just like to ask for additional clarification if you can provide it. As the Minister just mentioned, we understand this new legislation came into force on the 15th of July 2016. It provides for significant improvements in respect to the previous legislation from 1987. However, I would like to ask a few questions. Even though it may be a bit early to answer this, has this law already been implemented? Has there been a decree for its implementation yet? Can we now say that the law is fully applied? I'm asking this question because it leads me on to my second question. I'm wondering if the legislative framework is sufficiently disseminated so as to allow everybody, in particular women, to be aware of their rights and therefore to exercise their rights effectively. In your answers in paragraph 21, you tell us about the progress that this new legislation provides for in this domain. But what's particularly important for us is to know whether people actually understand this law. Not only women, but also the competent authorities who are responsible for actually enforcing the law. You were asked to tell us about measures taken to put an end to harmful practices and traditions, in particular polygamy, early marriage, forced marriage, FGM, levirate marriage, and so on and so forth. There are other bodies that you recently appeared before who raised similar concerns to you. I'm also asking a practical question here, because I've read your answers. You've told us about the provisions that are trying to deal with these problems, but what we would really like to know more specifically is, are these practical measures, either the measures that are in the pipeline or that those measures that have already been taken, are they really able in practice to stamp out these harmful practices? In your answers, we haven't seen any information about forced marriage, for instance. Is that something that remains widespread? Does it continue to be practiced? Is the state party really dealing with this issue? And if so, how? Linked to this, I would also like to ask the following question. Do you plan to take measures, such as prosecutions and so on, to ensure that these provisions are effectively applied in practice? Does the delegation have any information about the number of women affected, for instance, by the practice of FGM, if this practice continues to exist? Could you tell us about where the hotspots are in the country? We do have some information in the answers that you've given, but not on these specific issues. The information is more general in nature. Similarly, I would be interested to know if any prosecutions have been carried out, or if any are planned, to punish perpetrators of such practices. Could you also give us information about the possibilities for women who are victims to have access to assistance, to receive legal support, in particular when they are in a particularly vulnerable situation? How are victims actually cared for? Do victims have legal advice and support, and do they have rights to compensation? I would now like to move on to my third sub-issue, as it were. Which is about albino adults and children and their families. The committee has received information that says that many albino people, in particular women and children, are victims of attacks, violence, and even attempted kidnapping. The answers given by the State Party in paragraph 22, if I'm not mistaken, states that the Congolese Criminal Code protects the rights of albinos like any other social category. That is the only information we've received on this point. I would also note the concerns raised by the CRC from last February, who spoke about frequent attacks and violence and kidnapping of children with albinism. So, hence my question, do you have specific measures that you have taken in the State Party? Firstly, if there have been any inquiries that have been carried out and any prosecutions, but also have you carried out awareness raising in civil society? And more generally speaking, and this will lead me to a more general question, to which I didn't receive an answer in the answers that you gave. Have you set up a comprehensive legislation to root out discrimination? We've mentioned discrimination against women, discrimination against albino children, and I will be coming back to children's issues tomorrow morning. But it would be interesting for me to know if you have comprehensive legislation to deal with discrimination more generally. And I'm not only speaking about persons with albinism, but we've also received information, for instance, about human rights violations suffered by members of the LGBTQ community. It seems that there are human rights violations in that domain and arbitrary detentions. This is according to the information that's been given to us by civil society. So at this juncture, it would be useful to know if the state party has comprehensive legislation in place to deal with these issues. Now I move on to issue 5, Mr. Chairman, which has two themes. First of all, on women's representation in political and public life. I'll be quite brief on this. A recent report from the High Commissioner from last year notes that very little progress has been noted when it comes to strengthening and increasing the participation of women in elections. For example, in the new government, the government that took office in May 2017, out of 59 ministers, there are only 6 women. So I would like to know if the existing legislation provides for quotas for women's representation. And secondly, it seems that the legislation for elections doesn't provide for any measures for when women want to stand as candidates in elections. So I would just be interested to have some comments from you on that. On the second topic, which is equal access for women to education, on this, your answer in paragraph 29 just mentions guarantees for women to access the labour market, but your report, neither your report nor the answers you gave, provides more information on that. So could you now provide more information, perhaps in the form of statistics? You could submit it in writing, when it comes to the effective access that women enjoy to the labour market. Thank you very much, Chairman, and I do hope I didn't take too much time. Thank you very much. I give the floor to Ms. Branskeris.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I would also like to wish a warm welcome to the distinguished delegation, and I'm very glad to have this opportunity for dialogue within our committee. Today, I will only be addressing one issue, which is issue number 6, the first part of the question of violence against women. But I would just hope that the minute I save this afternoon will be added to my speaking time on issues 22, 23, 24 and 28, if I may be allowed that. On issue 6, thank you very much for the information you provided us with in the report and in the answers to the list of issues with regard to the initiatives undertaken to fight against violence against women. However, the answers on domestic violence are not very specific in nature. In particular, the reference to Law 16008 from 2016 with regard to the amendment of the Family Code, that doesn't provide us with any more information about the specific prohibition of domestic violence. I would be very grateful to receive more information on that, if there is specific legal protection against such violence, which also includes marital rape in the law and the criminal code, and if so, what punishments are foreseen for perpetrators. In the answers to the list of issues, you note that statistics for domestic violence almost inexistent, almost don't exist as a result of cultural factors, and that efforts are underway to try and change mindsets and behavior. So could you perhaps provide us with more information about any campaigns that you have rolled out, as well as their scope and their effect, and if you intend to carry them on? Have you carried out awareness-raising campaigns in the police services to ensure that they can intervene in cases of domestic violence? On the lack of statistics, does it mean that there is a lack of complaints, or is it simply a lack of infrastructure that makes it possible to receive complaints? Do you intend to take measures to facilitate access to make sure that women can lodge complaints in the cases of domestic violence? Have there been any inquiries and prosecutions carried out? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I now call upon Mr. Santos Pais. Thank you, Chairman. I would like to also extend a warm welcome to the delegation. I will strive to speak in French. I hope that you will understand my French, so I will do my very best in that regard. Today I would like to address issue 7 on gender-based violence. It would appear that gender-based violence isn't just a widespread problem in many countries, but it is also in the DRC. Based on information, there have been 1 million cases registered over the course of 2009 as a result of armed conflict. Almost 89.2% are women, whereas 0.8% are men. And this is probably the reason why the DRC has decided to place constitutional status on the problems of violence pursuant to Article 15 of the Constitution. Sexual violence and gender-based violence, first and foremost, are linked to armed conflict. And for example, when it comes to rape, 635 victims of rape in areas affected by the armed conflict, North and South Kivus and in Ituri, and 76% of victims were part of armed group. However, it would appear that 24% of cases of rape were conducted by state agents. Sexual violence is also committed in areas that aren't in conflict, particularly in schools, and we'll come back to that a little later. There's also socioeconomic and cultural violence. One of my colleagues mentioned early marriage, sexual mutilation, physical mutilation, witchcraft, believing in witchcraft, etc. And lastly then, domestic violence, to which Ms. Brandskaris mentioned earlier. So this gives increased importance to the publication of Law 006-008 on the Congolese Criminal Code, which to some extent has promulgated the international humanitarian standards and has incorporated them into the DRC. This law has also strengthened sanctions and penalties, and I would like to underscore this point because we are very pleased to note that, given that sexual violence has been used and continues to be used as a weapon of war during armed conflict in the DRC. 200,000 cases since 1986. This is also already an extremely high figure, but 4 women raped every 5 minutes within the DRC. This really is a very high figure indeed, even if I would take into account the information that you, Madam Minister, have provided earlier, that you have a zero tolerance policy, and this really is the backbone of the government's policy in that regard. I would like to focus on Law 06019 on the amendment to the Criminal Procedural Code to ensure that punishment is meted out to safeguard the dignity of the victim and to ensure that the victim has legal aid. So the first questions that I would like to ask of the delegation are as follows. What is the state of play with respect to the application of both laws? Do you have any statistics about their application, particularly statistics on the convictions handed down, the inquiries carried out, and the sentences handed down? And against how many people have these sentences been handed down? In the state party's replies, and they were very detailed replies here, you refer to the national strategy to combat gender-based violence and on the roadmap of the Ministry of Justice on combating impunity and sexual violence. So here, I would like to ask about the state of play of the National and Operational Action Plan of the National Strategy to combat sexual and gender-based violence, and in particular with respect to the establishment of technical committees at the national, provincial and local levels, and how you coordinate that struggle, and also the synergies between the provinces and how you combat the scourge of sexual and gender-based violence. So I'd like to know what outcomes have been obtained, what part of the state party's territory has been covered, how many people have taken part, and is there any link between the various actions undertaken? With respect to the roadmap of the Ministry of Justice, what does this roadmap actually consist of? How many activities have been carried out and what were the results? And what percentage has the roadmap actually reached? What is the pending part of the roadmap that needs to be tackled? When we start talking about one point, this leads us on to others. And so the information that you supplied to this committee has meant that we then have moved on to research other areas. I would now like to broach quite an interesting problem, this business of the mobile courts. And based on information on this issue, it would appear that the problem lies in the fact that crimes cannot be tried by the peace tribunals because the sentence applied is more than 50 years of imprisonment. It needs to be the district courts or the military courts that need to try sex-based crimes. So the problem here is to ascertain how these various courts are scattered across the national territory. Do they cover all regions in the country? And have convictions been handed down? And in that case, if so, for what crimes and what sentences? And against the perpetrators, what perpetrators of crimes are they civilian? Are they military? And if they are military, what are their ranks? One point raised based on information submitted by the committee point to the fact that holding these mobile courts depends on the financing from international players. Does the state party intend to invest further in this area to enable these courts to intervene in the rural, remote areas of the country and also in the larger cities? Let us move now on to the National Plan for the Armed Forces, which began in 2014. Do you have any information about the number of soldiers who have been involved in sexual violence? And if so, what is their rank, their status? You made reference in your opening statement to good officers. Now, when it comes to sexual violence in schools, of course, this affects those who require the most protection, that is to say, children. Several awareness-raising campaigns have been rolled out. Could you tell us about how many campaigns have been conducted and what parts of the country were covered by those campaigns? How many inquiries have been conducted against perpetrators and how many perpetrators? And I'd like to know about those involved, teachers, perhaps professors in faculties. What sentences have been handed down against them? I'd now like to turn to the issue of victims. Ms. Brands-Cairns referred to this point a little earlier. We talked about the opportunity of legal and jurisdictional free of charge aid, as well as medical and psychological assistance, which is also free to victims. Could the delegation tell us about how many cases this care, whether it be legal or medical and psychological, given to victims? And there again, what part of the country is covered by assistant establishments which are already working on the ground? I would like to know whether the government intends to encourage victims to make witness accounts. For example, to overcome the lack of knowledge of legal procedures by the victims, by providing free of charge legal aid, by overcoming the problem of local police posts, police stations. And above all, I'd like to know about the stigmatization risks for the victims when they report cases of intimidation. And we've been told about pressure to reach an amicable settlement, sometimes that run counter to legal provisions that don't accept that type of agreement. Several cases were submitted to this committee, and very often it's the courts, the judges themselves, who try to convince the victims to accept this type of settlement or agreement.
Par exemple,
for example, with respect to mass crimes, will the delegation think about setting up or providing collective reparation and not individual reparation, which is the case at the present time? Has the state party thought about a calculation system for redress or reparation to avoid the various gaps when it comes to the compensation granted to victims? Can one have other means of reparation, for example, rehabilitation, satisfaction through a legal mediator, and guarantees of non-repetition, for instance? With respect to the reintegration of victims in their communities, could you tell us about how many victims have benefited from being reintegrated? And coming to my last question now, and my apologies for posing so many questions, when it comes to the database on sexual violence from the General Auditor's Office, have you already set this database up. The Fund for Victims, is it already up and running? And if so, how many victims have benefited from it? And I will stop there for the time being. Thank you very much indeed in advance for your replies.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. And I now give the floor to Mr. Benachou.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, sir. I too would also like to greet the head of delegation and thank the delegation, as well as the Minister for Human Rights in the DRC. And I would like to thank and greet all of the delegation representing the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Today, I am tasked with issues 8, 9, and 14, and I'll start out by tackling issue 8. It primarily has to do with enforced disappearances, as well as summary executions. The issue there is to know whether inquiries have been effectively conducted, particularly against the officers of the state who were responsible for the enforced disappearances. I'd ask about the reasons for the arrest warrants launched, which are mentioned in paragraph 103 of the State Party report. I'd ask why those inquiries haven't concluded, and then about the measures taken to put a stop to arbitrary executions committed this time round by non-state armed groups. I'd like to ask about the events that took place in Kinshasa from the 19th to the 21st of September 2016 and the incidents that occurred between the 19th and 20th of December 2016, and finally the events linked to the Operation Likofi of the 15th of November 2013. The response by the State Party can be summarized as follows. As regards the arrest warrant against those who are mentioned in paragraph 103, the delegation tells us that in spite of the incessant requests by the DRC from Rwanda to extradite these alleged perpetrators, no follow-up has been given by Rwanda thus far. So I think that to date, no follow-up has been given to this extradition request to extradite the perpetrators. Then the measures taken to combat arbitrary executions by non-state armed groups, the state, in paragraphs 44 onwards of its replies, gives us a number of examples of prosecutions and convictions of persons by the military courts. I won't go into the details there because examples are given in paragraph 43. As to the events in Kinshasa between the 19th and 21st of September 2016, the State Party tells us that these are demonstrations that started out peacefully and then degenerated. In other words, these demonstrations led to expressions of violence, plundering, changes in the itinerary, changes made by the demonstrators. And this meant that the police was compelled to intervene in order to control the demonstration. As to the Operation Likofi of the 15th of November 2013 and the investigation regarding the mass grave which was discovered in March 2015 in Maluku, Kinshasa, the State Party there tells us that Operation Likofi was established to put an end to urban crime, that it was successful and that it yielded results. And it managed to decrease cases of urban crime. As to Maluku, you tell us that that mass grave does not exist, but rather this is a routine operation which began by the town hall of Kinshasa to deal with compatriots. This isn't a mass grave or victims of summary execution, but it's rather a cleanup operation, if you will, conducted by the Kinshasa Town Hall. So basically, they are the replies provided by the state party. And quickly, I would like to give you my comments and ask questions about the state party replies. First and foremost, I'd like to remind you of Recommendation 8 of the last concluding observations, which requested the state to open inquiries into acts of enforced disappearances or summary executions, to prosecute and punish appropriately the perpetrators of these acts, and to provide efficient and effective reparation, including appropriate compensation to the victims and their families. The question I would like to ask now is as follows. How many perpetrators of enforced disappearances or summary executions have been convicted and prosecuted? And I'd like to know, above all, whether efficient reparation has been granted to the victims or to their families. In actual fact, the state party doesn't deny the existence of enforced disappearances and extrajudicial executions. However, in its report, particularly in paragraphs 102 and 103 of the state party report, it says that these are down to negative forces. So the question that arises here is to ascertain what the state party understands by negative. Negative vis-à-vis what? What does this concept actually cover? What does it actually mean? Are these secessionists, or are they militia that have been manipulated by neighboring foreign forces in Congo? Are they political opponents? How do you exactly define these negative forces? Furthermore, the responsibility of arbitrary, summary, or extrajudicial executions are not only incumbent upon the militia and non-state armed groups. This means that the Congolese army and the Congolese police are responsible also. Just to look at some recent figures from 2017. Now, of course, I won't have the time to discuss all of this. I won't go into the detail of the reports drafted of the various years, 2015, 2016. I will take the most recent figures, which date back to August 2017. Based on the census carried out by the Central Office of the United Nations for Human Rights, over the course of August alone, there were 441 human rights violations. And the United Nations report tells us that state agents are responsible for almost 64% of the human rights violations that have been recorded. And this is still on August alone. 33 men are victims of summary executions, one woman and 20 children. Amongst the state agents, the main perpetrators of human rights violations are the National Police, as well as the armed forces, the military. Now, I'd refer to two documents which I feel to be important. First document, the shadow report of the FIACAT and the PACAT in the DRC. In particular, with respect to the very serious disturbances in the Kasai region, the shadow report of the FIACAT says that for over 1 year now, 1 year since the Kasai conflict broke out, there are 1,500,000 civilians affected by the violence. And as we all know, including 2 United Nations experts mandated by the Security Council to investigate into the human rights violations that occurred in the Kasai. To date, there have been over 200,000 deaths, 2,000 houses burnt in the villages of Musuosa, Bulungu, Kafuba, Kavula, Matomba, and so on and so forth. In July 2017, the soldiers from the armed forces of the DRC carried out an incursion into a number of villages and killed dozens of civilians, most of them young persons. They set fire to houses and they plundered what they found. Based on that report, those human rights violations are not subject to a reliable and credible investigation against the perpetrators. The second important document, just to take the most recent figures, this is a report from the mission of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the witness accounts of refugees fleeing the crisis in the Kasai region in the DRC. And it is also dated August 2017. Based on that document, which is very detailed indeed, and I cannot, of course, give you the details of it, I would simply focus on the assertion of the OHCHR's team that between the 12th of March and the 27th of June 2017, serious abuses and human rights violations against 224 people were committed by state agents. And it is also true by militia who are hostile to the government, and that it's often on the basis of ethnic criteria that these attacks and atrocities take place. Now, the problem is that there are no real, genuine inquiries carried out as regards these events and abuses. Not only are there no inquiries, but even more serious, and this is noted in the central office of the report by the United Nations, is that the Congolese authorities are not very diligent in opening investigations. And not only are they not very diligent, but they prevent bodies from doing so. It prevents them from verifying, carrying out the necessary verification. Thus, the United Nations Central Office for Human Rights was not in a position to undertake the various necessary verification because it was refused access to camps and other military structures. And also, visits to morgues or hospitals were also turned down because the team wanted to visit those facilities. Therefore, according to the UN office, these restrictions run counter to the agreement protocol in Kinshasa of an office of the United Nations, which was signed between Kinshasa and the OHCHR in 1996. So you will note that we have a number of alarming reports about the atrocities committed and, above all, about the enforced disappearances and arbitrary as well as extrajudicial executions. So, my question is the following. What is the delegation's reaction, first of all, to the Congolese authorities calling into question these acts? That's the first point. The second point, what are your reactions vis-à-vis impunity? And thirdly, your reaction about the refusal of the Congolese authorities to allow the bodies to undertake the necessary verification into the events. I will move on now to issue 9, and I'll be a lot briefer there, the application of the death penalty. In the responses, the state party says that the state respects a de facto moratorium, pursuant to which no conviction of capital punishment has been handed down for 14 years now. The state party also says that before ratifying the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which aims to abolish the death penalty, the DRC wishes to hold a national consultation in that regard. So my questions are as follows. Could you tell us about the number of convictions of death penalty handed down in recent years? Secondly, could you tell us about the status, the state of play of this national consultation? What is its content? Have you serious planning to undertake the national consultation? And what responses can the state party give us to those questions? Lastly, I will turn to issue 14, Organic Act number 13011B, which enables the civil courts to deal with international crimes. In paragraph 72 of the replies to the list of issues reads as follows, and I quote, "The military courts continue to be aware of crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity committed by the military or by the police pursuant to law, the military code." In actual fact, this new Organic Act 13011B has put an end to the exclusive jurisdiction of military courts in punishing international crimes, and has given jurisdiction to civil courts, in particular the appeals court, to deal with crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity committed by staff under their own jurisdiction. This is a step forward towards implementing Principle 9, the United Nations Principle on the Administration of Justice by the Military Courts. But really, this is quite a timid step forward. I would remind you that within the context of the DRC, the Human Rights Committee in 2006 had criticized the fact that military courts still operated in the DRC and had asked the country to abolish the military courts and replace them by ordinary courts. The Organic Act that we are discussing, 13011B, which dates back to April 2011, puts forward four major difficulties. One, the number of acts committed by those under the various bodies, given Article 11 of the law mentioned, apparently have been added to the legislative text following its final adoption by the Parliament and before its promulgation.
This makes the legality of this law disputable because it refers to the competence of the other courts, and it was not on those terms that the law was actually adopted by the Parliament, according to the information that we have received. This is a sentence that was added between the adoption of the law by the Parliament and its promulgation. Is that true? And if so, does that not jeopardize the validity of the law? Also, this law doesn't get rid of the competence of military courts. It doesn't do away with it. We have a complex problem really today because we're trying to work out how you can reconcile the competence of military courts and the competence of civil courts on the basis of the organic law from the 11th of April 2011. How will that be reconciled? So could the delegation explain how the 2013 law with regard to the functioning of the judiciary, how that is in sync with the law on the competence of military courts? Could you give us precise information about the implementation of this new law on the competence of courts dealing with international crimes? Thank you very much. That's it, Chairman. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Mr. Koita. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Madam Minister, like my colleagues, I would also like to congratulate your delegation. And I do hope that we will engage in a constructive dialogue when it comes to the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I will be dealing with issues 11 and 12. This relates to the protection of civilians and population displacement. And I will also be looking at impunity in this regard. In the committee's previous concluding observations in 2006, we invited the DRC to take all necessary measures to strengthen the state's capacity to ensure the protection of civilians, particularly women and children in conflict areas. Since 2006, however, the situation has got worse. Because during the presentation of the DRC's report to the UPR, apparently roughly 2.6 million people were considered as being IDPs within the country. And at the time, and in fact still today, there wasn't a complete legal system to provide protection and assistance to the civilian population. Beyond the decree going back to January 2013, putting in place the humanitarian system, beyond that, I'm wondering if the DRC has adopted any new laws, bearing in mind the scope of the assistance and protection that needs to be given to displaced persons. According to credible sources, roughly 3 million people are IDPs, and about 7.3 million people need to be provided with assistance in the country. This goes hand in hand with a security situation that has been severely exacerbated since 2006 in several parts of the country, particularly in Kasai, where there is a significant number of abuses carried out of extreme violence. This has led to mass killings committed both by security and defense forces of the DRC, working with other state agents, by a pro-government militia called Banamura, and by an anti-government militia, Kana Musa Sanapu. I do apologize for my pronunciation. Apparently, thousands of people died as a result of this violence, including very young children and pregnant women, since August 2016. And on occasions, this has led to the discovery of more than 80 mass graves that have been discovered. And this also includes attacks that have been carried out against villages where thousands of houses were burnt down. Without doubt, these crimes go against the criminal law in the DRC, but they may also be international crimes in nature. And given the scope and the scale of these atrocities, some of this abuse and violence could even be crimes against humanity. These human rights violations, unfortunately, are increasingly committed along ethnic criteria, which has led to mass movements of civilians within the country going towards neighboring states as well. Have the perpetrators been identified? It seems that there are witness accounts of these atrocities, but I'm wondering if arrest warrants have been sent out against the perpetrators. Is the government also able to make operational and effective the request for cooperation dating back to February between your country's military competence and the OHCHR, so as to carry out independent and impartial investigations into these abuses, as well as into mass graves, in order to prosecute and punish those responsible, to identify and provide compensation for victims? Is the government still willing to withdraw the restrictions and threats that might hinder the smooth running of a credible investigation? Still along these lines, is your delegation able to provide information to the committee about the evolution of the criminal proceedings into the death of the death of Mr. Michael Sharp and the other UN expert who was killed in March in the DRC? Given this very worrying backdrop, the committee would like to know what measures the government has taken to put an end to the forced return of persons to their own country, to put an end to the abuses carried out by the army during their displacement, to ensure that the army can offer protection to displaced persons, in particular during the current security situation, carry out prompt, transparent and independent inquiries to shed light on the abuses committed in the Kasai region, dismantle the militias and ensure that the security and defense forces deployed in the region are properly trained and equipped to protect the local population and are not involved in any human rights violations. In terms of the challenges to be overcome to overcome impunity for human rights violations in your country, during the period from the 1st of January 2014 to the 31st of March 2016, there were 7,380 reports of human rights violations across the territory. 55 allegedly carried out by state agents and 45% by armed groups. The convictions were mentioned in paragraph 43 of your answers to the list of issues. You did mention these matters there, but they're not very convincing and there's not a lot of information there compared to the need to uphold security and to respond to the many allegations that have been made that say that high-ranking members of the security and defense forces may have committed human rights violations that did not lead to any investigations, such as the head of the Mai Mai Sheka group, who is alleged to be responsible for serious human rights violations, and an arrest warrant has been sent out, but it hasn't been followed up, even though we know where the person is. It's also the case of the Katange chief, who went to the Congolese authority in October last, and there are many sources alleging that person's involvement. So what measures have been taken to follow up the committee's recommendations, that is to say, asking the DRC to fight against impunity and to carry out investigations and prosecute and punish those responsible for those violations? Thank you very much, Chairman.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
I see no other member seeking the floor, so I take it that the members have completed their questions on the first half of the list of issues. I propose that we have a break, short break, so 10 minutes break and meeting is suspended. Thank you very much for your cooperation. I'd like to resume the meeting to continue the dialogue with the distinguished delegation of the Republic Democratic of Congo. Members ask questions on issues 1 to 15, except 13. And I'd like to give the floor to the head of the delegation, Excellency Mme NUSHOBEKWA. I leave it to you to organize yourselves how to respond to the questions. I give the floor to Excellency Madam. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you very much. I will try to reply to all of the questions asked, even though I did note that some committee members asked the same questions. So I will reply to those questions asked just to avoid repetition. Mr. de Frouville, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. You talked about the cooperation between the government of the DRC, MONUSCO, and the United Nations Office for Human Rights. Mr. de Frouville highlighted that, unfortunately, assassinations took place, including 2 UN experts, Mr. Michael Sharp and Ms. Said Catalan. I would like to say that the 3 Congolese persons accompanying them were also killed and their bodies were never found. Those individuals aren't really talked about. As far as I know, they are also human rights who require justice and whose families need to know where their bodies are. To date, we are not aware of those details. So we would like to pay tribute to them, to remember them. We regret what happened to them, whether it be the 2 United Nations experts or their 3 Congolese helpers and other innocent victims who lost their lives in the Kasai atrocities. What you said, Mr. de Frouville, is that peace and justice go hand in hand with human rights. The president of the DRC underscored that point recently at the UN General Assembly in New York. He acknowledged that peace and reconciliation require justice, and that without justice there will be no reconciliation, and without reconciliation there will be no peace. We are doing our utmost as a government, as the civilian authority, to shed light on all of the atrocities committed in the Kasai province over the past year. The government has already opened inquiries. These are inquiries for which some had already concluded. I refer to the killings in Mwazalumba. This is a village in eastern Kasai. I think that you saw the video where undisciplined officers opened fire on innocent civilians. These soldiers were identified. 9 out of 11 of them have been tried and convicted. They are entitled to lodge an appeal, and if they do so... No, says the Speaker. 9 out of 11 have been tried and convicted. 2 haven't yet been identified. And we do hope that we will be able to find them one day and to be held responsible for their acts. Now, when it comes to what happened in central Kasai, as I have just said, the justice system has already started its investigations. We are doing the best with the resources available to us, but on the basis of transparency, we agreed for international experts from the United Nations to come to the country. Resolution 3533 voted in by the Security Council on the 23rd of June last states that these investigators will assist the Congolese government to allow for to seek the truth in what happened in the Kasai province. The conclusions of those investigations will be added to the cases already opened by the Congolese magistrates. All suspects will be prosecuted and tried by Congolese courts. Now, when you say that the government doesn't seem to be in a hurry, well, I don't agree with you there. Is not in a hurry to open inquiries. Perhaps you didn't say this. Perhaps it was Ms. Pazartis. Apologies for any mispronunciation of your name. A murder took place. The death of humans took place in the DRC. Not one person was killed. There were thousands, over 1,300 individuals were killed in the Kasai atrocities. They were basically decapitated by what the international media call the militia. But if that were to happen in Europe, in Switzerland, in Belgium or France, we would talk about terrorism. These are terrorist acts. They cannot be described in other terms. The death of humans did take place. We can't ask for these investigations to be open and concluded in 3 months, because in other countries that are deemed to be civilized, things can take 2 years to successfully conclude an investigation and to be quite sure that all responsibilities have been established and that these individuals be tried and have the right to a fair trial. So why would we want to bring pressure to bear on the Congolese government for these inquiries only to last between 3 and 6 months, whereas in other parts of the world, other countries are given time? I can tell you about how many Africans today are at the International Criminal Court. Now, I'll abstain from giving names, but I imagine that the prosecutor of the ICC, before he launched an arrest warrant, I imagine that he opened inquiries. Arrest warrants were issued and the suspects were tracked down. They were brought to The Hague. But the procedures took a long time. Some of them have been there for 5 years and haven't yet been tried. The trials are not yet over and decisions have not yet been handed down. Yet the court in The Hague has all full resources to do so. And you want us to do things in haste. You want us to conclude investigations, and then you say we violated human rights. Well, you're asking for something, but something else at the same time. Leave us some time to carry out investigations and to enable everyone to have the right to a fair trial. But if we do things hastily, perhaps innocent people will die in vain. We need to combat impunity. Our justice system needs to work. But we need also to respect the procedures. Now, let me come back to one point. My apologies. Let's talk about what happened in the Kasai. if the government of the DRC had something to hide, they'd never allowed the FBI, the US police, to be involved in the inquiries. And yet, just some weeks after the murder of the two United Nations experts, the FBI sent people to Kinshasa because, as you know, an American citizen lost his life on Congolese soil. And if the Swedish government were to ask the same thing, we would have accepted. And this has been done because Sweden asked to be involved in the inquiries. And that was done because we believe that the victims' families have the right to know what happened. We have nothing to hide. But let us follow all of the procedures as happens in all countries of the world. The Congolese individuals who have died, I do hope that you've seen the pictures of the Congolese police who were decapitated by the Kamenetsapu terrorists. Their heads were cut off. The heads were spread on the ground, 40 police heads, and the militia walked on their heads, filmed themselves and took photos. I would wonder what Western country would tolerate that for even a second. We are here to engage in a constructive, frank discussion to enable all of us to move forward. But when it comes to the death of Congolese individuals, these are human beings on an equal footing as any other persons. There aren't any good crimes or bad crimes. All crimes can be convicted and that can be condemned. What isn't accepted in other countries, well, we shouldn't be forced to accept it. If in France a madman was behind the steering wheel in Nice and killed people, and this, if it happened in other countries of Europe, we would talk about terrorism. The entire world would be horrified, all the TV channels around the world would make announcements to ask the entire world to react. The terrorist groups, the militia, come to the central markets with machetes. Recently this happened. They bore weapons, they shot civilians, they killed the person who ran the central market, whose daughter is now an orphan. She's 13 years of age and she's already lost her father. Who can accept that? We talk about human rights, but we must all be equal. There are no human rights depending on the part of the world you live in, depending on your race, your religion. What applies to the West must apply to the DRC. We must respect human life. Our deaths also deserve dignity. You talked about the amendment of the family code. Yes, it has indeed been amended. The previous family code prevented a married woman from working without authorization from her husband, and prevented her from carrying out any legal act without her husband's permission. That article was repealed, as I said to you in my opening statement. The family code has been amended and has been brought in line with the labour code, which states that a married woman can work without marital authorization, and that both spouses need to obtain each other's consent before carrying out any legal act. You also talked about the moratorium on the death penalty. This is a de facto moratorium and is in place for 14 years now, as was highlighted by one expert. It is true that there are some people who've been condemned to death and who are still imprisoned in the DRC. But for 14 years, there have been no executions. We are trying to move forward and evolve. Proposals have been put forward. We have those in favour of the death penalty and others who are not. And this doesn't only concern the DRC. It also affects other countries in the world who are grappling with terrorism today and are wondering what to do with these terrorists. What can we do about these madmen who wake up one morning and in the name of a religion or a belief, or a diabolic belief, decide to do away with others' lives? What do we do? This is the issue, the question that arises for everyone. In our country, we have dealt with mass sexual violence on a mass scale, mass rape used as a weapon of war, particularly by armed groups. And we are asking ourselves what to do. When you see a mature man who rapes a 6-month-old baby, what do you do? When he commits a rape, he enters the house, he rapes the mother, he rapes all of her daughters, and he forces the sons to have sexual relations with their mother. What do we say? Well, we say we have to maintain the death penalty. There are others who say that the death penalty should be abolished. We are looking at what we should do with respect to the realities of our own country. But as you have rightly pointed out, we do have a de facto moratorium in place and no executions have taken place. I'm not going to give you my personal viewpoint here because here I'm speaking on behalf of the government. You also mentioned the National Human Rights Commission, which is an institution which provides support to democracy. It is an institution which was set up to assist us in promoting and protecting human rights. It is true that a budget has been allocated to it, quite a significant budget at that. But the budget hasn't been fully implemented because the DRC is facing budgetary problems, as is the case in many other countries. Sometimes we have very difficult choices to make. Now, you know that our country is surrounded by 9 neighbouring countries, and all of those neighbouring countries aren't all at peace, which means that the armed groups operating in the neighbouring countries, while some of them come to the DRC to seek refuge. There are internal armed groups, and thus we must defend not only territorial integrity of the DRC, we must defend the security of the Congolese people and even foreigners living in the DRC who reside in our country. We must deal with education. We need to pay teachers. We need to focus on healthcare. Sometimes they're very difficult choices we need to make. And we try to strike a balance. That is why the National Human Rights Commission's budget is running at 30%. And we do hope that in the forthcoming months, things will improve and that we will be able to implement the National Human Rights Commission at a higher rate. As the Minister for Human Rights, I am aware of how important the Commission is and how important it is to be established in all provinces of the DRC. For those of you who aren't aware of this, in the past we had 11 provinces, but today we have 26. The DRC accounts for 2,350,000 square kilometers, with almost 80 million inhabitants. We have to face major challenges, and we are doing our utmost, we're doing our best to ensure that the National Human Rights Commission is set up in all provinces of the Republic. This is something perhaps that won't happen tomorrow, but as time goes by, as the years go by, we hope that we will be able to face that challenge thanks to your support and to your assistance. You talked about the participation of civil society in drafting the report and its implementation. I fully agree with you that civil society needs to be involved. All of the challenges that we must face when it comes to human rights and this is something which is cross-cutting in nature. You will understand there that we need to cooperate with civil society. Civil society represents the majority and which is present nationwide. The civil society needs to assist us, help us, open our eyes, enable us to open our eyes to things that perhaps we don't see or we don't see in the same way. As the Minister for Human Rights, I pledge a promise to you here that once I return to the DRC, we will resolve this problem. I spoke with my compatriots here about this in the room. We very much appreciate the support given by foreign NGOs. They too support us in several areas. Sometimes, however, we note that some NGO leaders become activists of the opposition. When one runs an NGO, one is not supposed to take sides. So they shouldn't take sides with the government or with the opposition. Recommendations are issued on either side, but we note that when it comes to some NGOs, they take sides. And well, given that they don't have Congolese nationality, they're not entitled to become activists within certain political parties. But for the NGOs who are objective and neutral, there are no problems there. They are, of course, free to assist us. You talked about customary law, which has been replaced by peace courts or peace tribunals. I can confirm here that a law was voted in and promulgated which withdrew all powers from customary chiefs and customary law. Customary law was substituted by peace courts. This is a process. Now, you know that things don't change overnight. And I do admire some countries who talk about 200 years of democracy, and others have taken 100 years to gain democracy. So you need to understand that we will move forward gradually. We are doing our best to improve things, but we don't have a magic wand to change everything. We have our customs, our grandparents, our great-grandparents who had a certain lifestyle. Today, the world has developed and evolved. And people need to be made aware and must understand that customary law cannot take precedence over the laws in our country. The customary chiefs need to understand that they are not above the laws of the Republic, because we cannot be asked to do away with our customs, such as dowry. Customary marriage does exist in many African countries. It exists before entering into civil marriage. So we do have our customs when it comes to births and customs that exist in all countries of the world. Obviously, there are ill practices and customs that need to be abolished. Of course, we cannot negotiate there. But what I wanted to say is that these peace tribunals are being established. But at the same time, the greatest challenges we face is to raise awareness amongst the people. They need to understand that the law is the law and takes precedence over customs and applies to everyone. This will take a lot of time, however. Now, you also mentioned abortion. Which is prohibited by the Criminal Code in the DRC. Yes, these are our laws. These are the laws of the DRC. They have been voted by the Congolese Parliament. And as a member of the government, I must respect the laws voted by the Parliament. You suggest that we enhance that law by accepting safe abortion. However, we would need to ascertain whether Congolese society is willing to accept abortion. This is also a reality. We live in a society where religion is very important indeed. And I know that in some Western countries, this did take some time for people to accept abortion. I would take once again the example of France, because our constitution is more or less based on the French constitution, and we have a lot of French media in the DRC. Now, of course, I'm not going to advertise them, France 24 and others. France took a long time to accept abortion. And when French society did accept it, the law was voted in. We cannot vote in a law that is not accepted in our society just because other countries in the world are doing so. I believe one committee member raised the issue of the rights of homosexuals. And some years ago in Western countries, homosexuality was considered to be a crime. In any event, homosexuals were condemned to prison. And in other countries, homosexuals were deemed to have mental disturbances, but societies have moved on since then. But you cannot ask us to develop at the same rate as the Western world. When the Western world says no to something, abortion isn't good, homosexuality isn't good, that we're obliged to accept it. And when society evolves, these become good things. Abortion is good now, it's positive. Homosexuality is positive. So we should also bow down to that. No, we are not machines. We are human beings. We have our own culture, our customs. The Constitution of the DRC says that a woman cannot marry a woman, and a man can't marry a man, and a man can't marry another woman. And all of the religions in the DRC are recognized, whether they are Catholicism, Protestantism, Islam, they're all against homosexuality. And we're not going to be asked to accept this. We are not ready or willing, our society is not willing, we're not ready to accept it. We won't be compelled to accept it. We need to have time, but for the time being, that discussion won't take place in our country. I can't even promise you that. That's just not possible. It's not possible in our country. The debate is closed.
Alors, vous avez parlé de...
You mentioned 50% unwanted pregnancies in Kinshasa. I do have to say that that rate seems to be rather high to me. I don't have the exact figure, but if you look at Kinshasa, and I'm speaking about the urban agglomeration as well, you're talking about 10 million inhabitants there. And that includes, of course, adults, children, elderly people, people who are sick, religious leaders. So how on earth did we get to 50% unwanted pregnancies? I think that's far too high. We could perhaps propose some solutions. Perhaps that could be integrated within training. Perhaps we could include sexual education. I'm not sure that our society is going to accept that, however, because I'm not sure that our society will allow sexual education to children in schools. But perhaps over time we will see if that can change so that we can avoid unwanted pregnancies from a certain age. Perhaps we would be able to include sex education in schools. But we're not going to be recommending contraceptives to children because this is our culture. We have a different culture. We can't simply all be the same. This is diversity, and we must accept that people are different. It allows us to build a better world. And so that is our culture. It's just not possible for us to talk about contraceptives to children in schools. But when a minor gets pregnant, I've told you that the criminal code bans abortion. If the minor gets pregnant, that means that they have had sexual relations with somebody. And the Congolese law states that engaging in sexual relations with a minor is considered as rape. So the perpetrator would be prosecuted for rape, regardless of whether there was consent. If the person was a minor, then it would be considered as rape. But even if the girl was older, then abortion would still be banned. And we have to comply with the law until such a day as legislation may evolve. You also spoke about the deaths of several women in pregnancy. Unfortunately, we don't have the statistics to hand. As you know, we have been grappling with armed groups in several provinces of the country. But it is true that there are women who do die during pregnancy. This is a serious problem that we're dealing with, and it is a problem that we need to remedy. It's not possible for a mother to die giving birth. It's simply unacceptable. Many of these women die because they don't have access to prenatal care. Perhaps they don't have the financial resources either to benefit from such prenatal care. Others die because they don't have enough money to give birth in appropriate hospitals. And some others die because they get to the maternity ward too late. And so that leads to a caesarean being carried out for various reasons. But some people believe that caesareans are a curse, and so they don't want to perform caesareans, and that leads to further medical complications, and the baby can even be lost. And when the doctor steps in, it's too late. So that is a major challenge we have to overcome. Among the proposals that the Prime Minister has made, they also include the ambition to make sure that all pregnant women can give birth for free in future years in the DRC. But that will require resources. We're currently looking into how to achieve that, but it is one of the priorities that the government has set itself. You also spoke about torture. You said that the law on torture is rarely enforced. You asked us how many people had been convicted on the basis of having committed torture. Now, there is a law which does punish torture in all of its forms. I do acknowledge that the law is not sufficiently understood throughout the country. I believe that it needs to be made more understandable to people. Judges need to be more aware of it, ditto police officers in charge of enforcing the law. But we also need to raise awareness among the general population. We need to say clearly that torture is a crime under the law in all of its forms. And indeed corporal punishment, for example at school, or torture in detention centres. I don't know if you neglected to speak about women or children who are beaten, who can be struck violently by their parents, for example. Some people believe that that is allowed. So people need to be made aware of the fact that this is a crime under the law. And it's only by doing that that we will make sure that we can get the rate of torture, the incidence of torture down, to make sure that torture is swiftly punished when it occurs. And perhaps if there are public trials, then that may discourage future crimes. Ms. Patsatis also mentioned the issue of traditional practices, harmful traditional practices, such as forced marriage, polygamy, and FGM. As far as I'm aware, in the DRC, there are no forced marriages. Or at least those forced marriages that may have occurred would have involved armed groups who would have compelled young women, would have taken them as sexual slaves, and would have compelled them to marry in far-flung areas and villages where they won't even be found. They would be taken not even as a spouse. I wouldn't use the word spouse because it's too dignified a word. But anyway, these women would be perhaps taken against their consent, so that would in fact be rape. But in any case, in the DRC, there are no forced marriages. The law bans it, but it's not in our custom anyway. Because before a civil marriage can be concluded, even the modified, amended family code states that, first and foremost, there has to have been a customary marriage. That is to say, the two families must have met and agreed that their children are going to marry, and those two people must have made a free choice to marry. It's after customary marriage that it moves to the civil stage to conclude the marriage. And once again, you have to present your birth certificate to prove that you're over a certain age and so on. And then you will be asked if that has been a free choice. So, as far as I know, forced marriage does not exist in the DRC. The family code also prohibits polygamy. Polygamy is prohibited. It's only a monogamous society in the DRC. Those who have mistresses well, that is not something that exists. We don't acknowledge the status of a mistress in our country. That may occur in some other states, but in the DRC, polygamy is banned. On FGM, I can also say that it doesn't exist in the DRC. Now, there may have been cases of sexual violence where women have suffered greatly, but again, we're talking about armed groups. But I know that in some states in Western Africa, FGM does exist, and there's some people believe that excision provides greater prestige, but it's not something that exists in the DRC. It's not one of our customs, and we therefore don't recognize it as being part of our culture. The expert also asked if there have been any criminal proceedings. Well, given that we haven't seen cases of forced marriage or FGM, except in the case of the armed groups. The armed groups who raped and mutilated women. when the perpetrators were identified in those cases, they were brought to justice. Ms. Patsartis also mentioned albino adults and children, some of whom are alleged to have been kidnapped. Recently, I had a meeting in my section with representatives of the albino community. As far as I know, in the DRC, albino children go to the very same schools as other children. I know albinos who are pharmacists, bankers, all sorts, and there's no discrimination there. I certainly don't believe there have been any murders of albino children as a result of traditional practices, as may occur in other countries. In the DRC, that doesn't exist. And that is what the albinos told me. They asked me to speak out in their favor. Often when they are exposed to the sun, they don't have sun cream to protect their skin. They asked me to tell the president of the Independent Electoral Commission that on the day of the elections, that they be given priority like elderly people and pregnant women because they don't want to be exposed to the sun for too long as a result of their pale skin, which can't stand the sunlight. But during that meeting, they didn't mention any physical attacks or anything like that that they'd suffered. Ms. Patsartis also mentioned homosexuals. I think I've already answered that question. She also mentioned women's representation in political life. Now, I have seen the same thing as you because I am a member of the government, and there's only 6 of us out of 57 members. And that's unfortunate. It's not due to a lack of qualified women. It's not due to a lack of women who have the same skills as men. It's not because women don't want to take part in the political system, but the system means that a lot more commitment is required. And unfortunately, women have to be a lot more committed. I won't tell you how many threats I get on my phone because people are following me and tracking me. I won't go into this issue too much. I'm a mother and I don't want my children to hear me getting hot under the collar, but I must say that it is difficult for women. Speaking about men, men aren't able to call into question your skills or your diploma or your ability to carry out the job, what will they say? Well, they might say what they say in other countries, in Switzerland, France, and elsewhere. I have to say, what happens? A lot of other women in politics say that the attacks we suffer are unacceptable. You really have to have nerves to withstand these attacks. Many women simply throw in the towel because they can't stand the vitriol that they suffer from, and with social networks it's even got worse. Some people have mock-up pictures of their face online. I know someone who that happened to. A friend of mine her face was put online, or her face was put on another person's body on a picture, but that's not something you see happen to men. It's because people want to put down, people want to criticize women. And so if you're not going to throw in the towel, you have to be really strong-willed as a woman in politics. That's the unfortunate state of affairs. Even when women have the right skills, sometimes they step back. They're just afraid to take the step forward. I know that there are a lot of women who would be qualified enough to work in politics in the DRC. We have this target of 30% of women, and this is recommended by the UN, the 30% quota. But it's a fight that we have to lead. It's a struggle. It's something that will take a long time. I do hope that we will achieve the goal. There are only 6 of us in this government. Perhaps in the next government there'll be 12 of us, and then maybe in 5 or 10 years we'll be at 50-50. It'll be half men, half women. We just need to lead this struggle. It's not going to be handed to us on a plate. We have the same skills, but we just have to carry on this struggle. You asked if a law had been voted on, a law which would say that an electoral list could be rejected if the 30% quota were not fulfilled as recommended by the Constitution. No, unfortunately, the law did not get through the Parliament. The National Assembly and the Senate did not vote that law through, and so we have to accept the law as it currently stands. The government can't do anything about that. We have the separation of powers. When the Parliament doesn't accept a law, we can't do anything about that. You also spoke about guarantees for women on the labour market. Well, yes, because in the Constitution, under the Constitution, women and men are equal. Today, the education system has improved a great deal because equal opportunities are provided to young women as are provided to young men. They all go to school, and the attendance rate of young girls in school today is 80%. I'm speaking about education because if you talk about the labour market, then you first of all have to consider what's happening in education. All the laws give women the same opportunities as men. But society is such that women have to fight. I know that the same thing happens in the West. Women have the same problems. You may be applying for a job in a bank and you're competing against a man, and the man might say to you, you have a beautiful dress or you have a beautiful hairstyle, but you're not interested in that. You've gone for a job interview. We have the same problems ourselves. I know that some MPs in Western countries have spoken out against sexism at work. It exists everywhere. But I think that men need to help women in the struggle, and I do think that if that happens, then things will evolve over the next few years. Of course, there need to be laws backing that up, and there need to be laws punishing sexual harassment at work, for example. We don't have such a law in the DRC, unfortunately. Such a law would protect women at work. Ms. Keris, Ms. Branskaris spoke about domestic violence. She asked whether or not domestic violence is as a result of social and cultural factors, and I would say the answer to that is yes. People need to be educated. Domestic violence needs to be considered like any other form of torture. Those carrying out domestic violence therefore need to be hauled before the courts like anyone else who was found guilty of practicing torture. But once again, as there are social and cultural burdens, education is necessary. People need to be educated so that they understand why complaints need to be lodged when one has been a victim of domestic violence. You spoke about marital rape as well. You asked whether inquiries had been carried out. If marital rape does exist, and I assume it does, I believe that my friends from the NGOs who are here in the room will say that Congolese women are not allowed to speak about their sexuality in public. So even when they suffer marital rape, I really doubt that they would speak about it even to their parents, because there's a taboo. So you can understand that the government can't be aware of those things if the victims aren't even telling their parents about it. It certainly does exist, but we can't invent statistics. Women don't talk about these matters in public. We can't do anything about that. If people don't lodge complaints, we can't do anything about that. But the problem is one of a taboo. People need to be made aware in society that you can speak about these matters. And then, subsequently, we can look at how to remedy the situation. You asked if the police was trained to deal with this, but of course they can't be if it's a taboo subject, so it's difficult.
D'accord. Donc le président me dit que...
The chairman is telling me that we have to wrap up in 2 minutes. So if the chairman allows me, I will respond to the other questions tomorrow morning. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Madam, the head of the delegation. I'm afraid we ran out of time. I understand that the delegation has not completed their responses to our questions in the first round. So I propose that we continue tomorrow morning with the responses from the delegation to the questions by the members. I propose that we give the delegation 20 minutes at most, not more than 20 minutes to respond and to conclude your responses. And then I give the floor to the members for follow-up questions to your responses. But I think I ask members to combine your follow-up questions to your questions in the second half of the list of issues. And then we give the floor back to the delegation to respond to all the questions, follow-up question to the first list of issues, and also the questions on the second half of the list of issues. We need a balance of time between the members, between the time given to the members and the time given to the delegation. And I'd like to ask members of the committee to be succinct in your intervention tomorrow morning. And I would like to ask the members and also the other people in the room to come back on time after the break because the delegation was ready to respond, and the other people were not ready for the resumption of the meeting. So those are my requests, and I thank you very much for your cooperation, and I'd like to adjourn the meeting for this evening, and I wish you a good evening.